So you should have a warning come up, Phil.
Oh yeah, yeah, got it. Yeah, we're on.
Okay, very good. Right, hi everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining us. It's myself and Phil here. Hi Phil.
Hello, James. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Phil.
And,
yes, we're going to talk about the increase or the rapid increase in nitrogen prices today, Phil, aren't we?
yeah, that's right. It's a very worrying topic for a lot of farmers, James.
It is, yeah. I think, and it depends also how much nitrogen you use in a normal year. But the increase in prices, yeah, really does make just give reason to think about how it's being used in the system. And I think, fortunately, there's lots of things we can do to reduce our usage of it, or if we are using it to get the most from it. And so that's hopefully what we're going to talk through today.
Brilliant.
So we do a few slides to take us on this journey. I'm just going to share those with everyone. There we go. Can you see those your side, Phil?
I can.
Lovely. Okay. So yeah, so managing the increase in nitrogen prices from myself, James Daniel, Precision Grazing, and with Phillip Pengelly from the Penwith Landscape Partnership, and this is brought to you by the Penwith Landscape Partnership. So we're going to chat about the role of nitrogen, the cost of it versus its benefit, and then we'll look at some short-term options to reduce our usage of it. And they will include grazing management, the farm business, alternative sources of forage, soil health, capital fertiliser, meaning lime, and also some medium-term options, which might include use of legumes and other pasture species. And then also a quick chat about what should we be prepared to do in spring of 2022, which is hopefully just around the corner.
Yep.
So the role of nitrogen really is a growth promoter. We know that when we apply artificial nitrogen, the grass grows a darker shade of green and it starts growing quicker for a period of time. And that's because nitrogen is an essential element or part of plant growth. It gets converted into protein, and that's used as one of the building blocks for the plant itself. So that's a bonus. Nitrogen increases plant growth for a given period of time. The negative side is that artificial nitrogen replaces or displaces some of the normal soil's normal biological function. So when you apply artificial nitrogen, it bumps out or takes the place of nitrogen fixing bacteria that would otherwise live in a healthy soil. And that
what sort of level of nitrogen input sort of stops clover sort of producing biological N?
Yeah, so I guess we've got two pieces, haven't we? We've got the role clover plays, and we know that high levels of nitrogen suppress or almost can eradicate clover from a sward. Then we've also got the role that nitrogen fixing bacteria play, and high levels of nitrogen, or really any level of nitrogen, suppresses those bacteria. The issue with high levels, so anyone's used perhaps more than 150 to 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. So that's in equivalent terms to 200 to 250 units an acre. The soil and plant become quite reliant on that artificial input. So to just stop using it really wouldn't be appropriate, and instead the farm's going to be weaned off. And now the weaning off is going to be a challenge, because we could talk about weaning off if nitrogen had gone up 20%. We could say, well, maybe we'll use 20% less. But nitrogen's not gone up 20%. It's gone up from 240, 250 pounds a tonne last year to, I've seen most prices over 600 pounds a tonne. I think you said earlier, Phil, you've had a quote of 780.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And so the decision, really, the instant reaction is to think, well, how do we stop using it altogether? But to do that's going to mean we need to take quite a big system change in terms of looking at things like stocking rate, or really consider our other options. So we look through what some of those other options are. But yeah, the price increase is huge. I think in total, over the past 12 months, agricultural inputs themselves just generally have gone up 23%. And once the nitrogen price is kind of recognised in that report, I reckon it will jump to 50%.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, making a big difference. Really, it's going to have a massive impact on profitability on farm if it's not dealt with pretty quickly. So when it comes to using it now, efficiency is going to become very important, and efficiency with inputs was also important. If you pay £1 for nitrogen, you really hope it's going to give you £2 back.
I can see from your graph that you've got sort of 2.5 times nearly difference between the first site and the fourth site. Yeah.
Yeah, so we talk about efficiency. What efficiency means relating to nitrogen specifically is that for 1 kilo of nitrogen applied, so that's not necessarily 1 kilo product, that's 1 kilo of actual nitrogen, the bit that's doing having the response from the plant. How many kilos of dry matter do we get in return? So how much extra yield do we get for that extra kilo of N that we're applying and we're paying for? So there's some work done last year in Wales across a range of sites, and they're looking at the efficiency of granular fertiliser in terms of how much extra yield was there compared to plots with no fertiliser. So you see in site 1, they applied 275 kilos of N per hectare per year, and that gained them 2,700 kilos of dry matter, which is a response rate of about 10 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you see in site 4, they applied a lot more nitrogen, they got a bigger yield response, and the efficiency was greater at 22 to 1. So the range I would see on farm, and most experimental work seem to have shown, is somewhere between 5 to 30 kilos. Mm-hmm. So if a kilo of nitrogen is costing £2, then whether it grows 5 or 30 kilos of dry matter, it's going to make a big difference to the cost of those kilos.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail, but efficiency is really important, and we can do some stuff to improve the efficiency of that. Whatever we do to improve the efficiency of nitrogen will also just improve the efficiency of us growing grass anyway. So it's a bit of a win-win. So where the first industry to kind of show or indicate a recommendation or response to the increase in nitrogen prices is for an arable, because you imagine if you think about an arable business, it's quite relatively clear kind of inputs and outputs and price and stuff, and they can forward sell and buy forward. So their costs are generally quite clear, or a bit clearer than some livestock systems are, where maybe there's several enterprises mixed up. So in arable, what they used to say was that for 1 kilo of nitrogen, they needed a 5 kilo response with grain, or a 2.5 kilo response with oilseed, and that would get their response. That that up to then using nitrogen was profitable. And it's really interesting to look at some of the research work that was done within arable. And the graph there's got 2 lines. The orange line, if we focus on that for a minute, it's showing that for the first 50 kilos of nitrogen applied, so kilos of nitrogen per hectare along the bottom of the graph, it gives a yield response. So we've got a yield that goes from 6.3 tonne of grain per hectare. With 50 kilos of nitrogen applied, it's lifted to 8. So 50 kilos is nearly giving us a 2 tonne response. So that's a really high return rate, a really high efficiency. The next 50 kilos of nitrogen applied only gives maybe a 1 to 1.5 tonne response. And then the next 50 kilos of nitrogen applied is giving less than half a tonne response. So that curve starts flattening off. It means the more nitrogen you apply, the less effective it is, and the less of a yield increase it's having. And it also gets to the point where for the extra nitrogen you're applying, you're not getting enough kilos of grain to pay for the nitrogen. And so what's happened in arable, it's gone from a 5 to 1 break-even ratio to a 10 to 1 because the price is doubled. Yeah. And in our livestock systems, we've got to think about where are we on this curve? How many kilos can we afford to apply to get a good response before the extra kilos we apply aren't providing any profit?
Yep.
So in arable, they've come up with a sort of rule of thumb is that everyone should apply 50 less kilos of nitrogen to cereals and 70 less kilos of nitrogen to oilseeds, and it's going to give a small yield reduction, but that yield wouldn't have been profitable anyway with the increase in nitrogen cost. So the same is going to be true in livestock. We're just going to work out where that response piece is. So I think a good way to think about it in terms of your farming system, and your being those of you at home with farms listening to this, is that assuming you're a conventional farm that uses nitrogen, then you've got 2 types of grass growing on the farm. You've got the grass that you grow, let's say, organically. So it's the grass that the farm would grow without any nitrogen. And that depends on the soil health, the pasture species, and your grazing management. And you can really affect and change 3 of those, all 3 of those. And then you've got the nitrogen or the grass that's been grown with nitrogen. And you can see that as a sort of the extra on top that wouldn't grow if you didn't apply the nitrogen. And there's different costs for each of those. So let's look at where those costs come from. So the stuff that's growing, let's say organically, so this is the grass that you'd grow anyway. Well, the cost behind that are rent, whether that's actual or imputed. The cost of lime, just to maintain the pH where it is. The cost to reseed, if you're reseeding maybe 5 to 10% of the farm each year, gives us a total cost of £320 a hectare. If the farm could grow, and many farms can without nitrogen, 8 tonne or 8,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare per year, the cost for 8 kilo of dry matter will be 4 pence. So that sounds pretty cheap, and it is quite cheap. So it's a really low cost form of high quality feed. Now, nitrogen piece, a few more boxes. So we'll just go through it line by line. If we're paying £650 a tonne for nitrogen, and we're buying ammonium nitrate, so it's 34% nitrogen, and we apply 312 kilos of product per hectare, or 250 units per acre in a year, then the cost of that nitrogen we're buying in is £1.91 per kilo of N. So we then have a spreading cost. So let's say we apply that in 3 applications, and each application costs us £5 an acre. So that's man and machine. That adds £37 per hectare. And then we've got to put the lime on to neutralise the acid that's contained in all nitrogen fertilisers. And rule of thumb is 2 kilos of lime per kilo of nitrogen. Right. So in this case, we're putting on 106 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So we need 212 kilos of lime. And if that costs us £35 a tonne for the lime plus including the spreading, then there's an add-on lime cost of 743 pence, sorry, of £7.43. So it gives us a total nitrogen cost per hectare of £247, or it's actually £100 an acre. And it means that 1 kilo of nitrogen is actually costing us £2.33.
Yep.
So assuming we've got reasonably good soil health, pH is in the right place, and conditions are good when we spread it, we could hope to convert that 100 kilo of nitrogen into 1,500 kilos of extra pasture. And if we did that, then the extra pasture would cost us 16 pence.
Yep.
So in that scenario, with nitrogen at £650 a tonne, with a pretty good efficiency rating of 15 to 1, 15 kilos of dry matter per kilo of nitrogen, the extra pasture we're growing using nitrogen is costing us 16 pence. So the question is, could we convert that feed at 16 pence per kilo dry matter into something that's profitable?
Yep.
So how many kilos do our animals need to give us a litre of milk, or to give us a kilo of live weight, which we can then sell for profit?
Yep.
Yep. That's what we'll look at next. So let's have a look at a typical enterprise. Hang on a minute, just go ahead and share. Let's do that one. There we go. Yeah, so let's look at a typical enterprise. So this is a beef sort of growing and finishing enterprise. And what this enterprise does, it buys in a weaned suckler calf, or buys in a suckler calf at weaning, and takes it through to finish at 20 months. So during that time period, let's say the calf's 6 months when it comes on farm, it goes out at 20 months, so it's on farm for 14 months. It would eat 4,200 kilos of dry matter, so eat 4 tonne of pasture, and that's roughly equivalent to 16 round bales of silage. It's got a feed conversion ratio of 12 to 1, so for every 12 kilos of dry matter it eats, it produces 1 kilo of live weight. So the weaned calf comes in at 280 kilos, the finished animal goes out 620, 340 kilos are gained, so it's gaining 340 kilos of live weight, having eaten 4,200 kilos of dry matter, converting at 12 to 1. If the live weight gain is worth £2.20 a kilo, then the gross income revenue is £748 per animal. And in terms of kilos of dry matter, that farm is making 18 pence per kilo dry matter. So how much profit's being made? Well, looking at the pasture alone, it depends on how it's being grown. So if that animal is eating grass that's grown on the farm without nitrogen, so what the farm can naturally grow through its soil health and fertility, pasture species and grazing management, then that grass has cost 4 pence per kilo dry matter. The revenue is 18, so we're making 14 pence per kilo dry matter. If the animal was eaten or been held on the farm or been, i.e. supported on the farm by grass growing with nitrogen, that grass next year will cost 16 pence. So that only gives us a 2 pence per kilo dry matter margin in order to pay all the other variable costs that are associated with that enterprise. And that 2 pence doesn't really sound like a lot to cover all the other variable costs that sit on that enterprise, I suspect. So to put it into money terms, that would leave £84 a head. After you paid for the nitrogen that was used to grow the grass that animal ate, it would leave £84 a head to pay for all the other costs. That would include bedding, machinery, labour, so on.
Right, yeah.
So if we look at a range of enterprises, we can look at the difference basically from grass grown just with the fertility on the farm, and then the cost of grass growing with nitrogen. And we see that in dairy, there's a difference of about 10 pence in terms of gross profit per kilo dry matter. So next year, if you're growing grass with nitrogen and it's being converted at 15 to 1, 15 kilos of dry matter per kilo of nitrogen, then that grass is leaving you with a margin of 30 pence per kilo to cover all the costs in the business. For a suckler enterprise, any grass that's grown with nitrogen that is eaten by a suckler cow and calf, then potentially that business actually is losing money. So it's not, the suckler cow's not producing enough live weight to justify the cost of growing that grass with nitrogen. The suckler system, where you're buying in a wean cow taken through the finish, that's slightly better. So that's looking at a small profit there, but maybe not enough to cover the variable costs. A dairy beef enterprise taking a weaned calf through the finish is better at 8 pence. In a sheep systems, a ewe of twins is making 10 pence per kilo dry matter margin on grass grown with nitrogen, compared to 20 pence with grass grown just organically. But a ewe with a single just isn't producing enough live weight for the amount of feed that she eats in a year to be able to grow grass using nitrogen. So obviously a few assumptions in this graph, but it does show the impact the increase in nitrogen price is going to have on potential profitability for a majority of systems, and dairy will be under pressure as well, because there's a lot more variable costs associated with dairy that could cover a kilo of dry matter. So the answer really is to stock the farm to its productive capacity and to consider carefully whether nitrogen should be used. So the nice thing is we can influence the farm's productive capacity quite strongly by relatively simple things.
How many people do you think would sort of move away from stocking towards alternative grazing, James? Do you think there's a lot of room in the system for that?
Yeah, I think there's not really good data around in the UK in terms of how many people are managing, moving their animals often enough to be classed as kind of actively managing their grazing. But the majority of grazing management in the UK, and I think the majority of grazing management in the Penwith area, is probably still around the set stocking to kind of continuous variable grazing. What it means is that the animals don't move, they occasionally move to a new field, but the opportunity is to move towards rotational or paddock grazing. And what it means is that if we could move animals to a new field, let's say 3 times a week, and we could provide an appropriate rest period for the paddock that they leave behind, then that farm would improve or increase its grass growing ability. And it could do that within or instantly. So you change your grazing management for next year. If your animals were mainly set stocked, then you could change to move them to change the management. Maybe need to make some changes to infrastructure, such as water trough locations and some fencing. But if you did that, then what most people would see is they'd be able to grow an extra 1,000 or 3,000 kilos dry matter per hectare. So, and that's generally more than enough to offset the nitrogen fertiliser that they were using.
So there's quite a quick way out of the problem then, really.
Yes, there is. Again, this would not apply to maybe a highly stocked high nitrogen user. So a lot of dairy farmers would be paddock grazing already and using quite a lot of nitrogen. So it's not a solution for them, but it certainly would be a solution for anyone that's a dry stock farmer. So that would be beef and sheep that has the ability to improve their grazing management.
I see.
Would be a really instant or a really good option. And there's other benefits that come with improving grazing management, such as improved pasture species composition, improved pasture persistency and longevity, increased length of grazing season as well, which you don't get with nitrogen fertiliser alone. So that is probably the bigger win, and the first thing that we should be assessed and tackled. The other fairly big and quick wins is around the soils piece. And I'm sure many people listening would be more than aware, and maybe already do, is that every field on the farm, regardless of what it's growing, should be soil tested every 3 years. There's more of an interest now as to what that soil test should cover. Should it just be N, P and K and pH, or should it include the full mineral analysis of all the minerals as well to really see what's going on? With regards to soil testing, particularly with regards to pH, then that's something that the Penwith Landscape Partnership can offer.
Yes, we can do up to 10 free samples per farm. And then if you wanted more done, we could do that at cost price.
Yeah, so hopefully that means that most farms, if they haven't sampled or there's fields that are overdue a sample, can make use of that offer and get the field sampled up to date. Obviously, sampling is the first part. The second part is in acting on those recommendations. And the soil fertility piece, the big ones we see is in pH correction first, and then P and K correction second. But the pH is the first thing to focus on. The other part of soil is soil health, and that's mainly the soil structure. So assessing that structure and then correcting any compaction that's seen. And the reason we want to correct compaction is we want air to be able to get into the soil, because air is needed, or oxygen in particular, is needed and is used by the nitrogen fixing bacteria that could exist in a healthy soil. And if you can reduce the amount of nitrogen, artificial nitrogen that is being applied, then getting oxygen into the soil is going to be essential to help those bacteria kind of develop and spread. So this soil structure assessment is also available through the Penwith Landscape Partnership.
Yes, we can try a compaction assessment for you, and we can also we've also got the soil aerator, which is available for hire, which is £60 a day plus VAT.
Yeah, perfect. And that's a roller type machine with a spiked drum, isn't it?
That's right. Yes, did offset spikes. Yes, that's right. And we can get that delivered for you and then picked up.
Yeah. So again, it shouldn't be used without a need being, there being proof of a need.
No, yeah, that's fair comment. Yes, that's exactly right. I can go over and do a sort of use a penetrometer and give you a report on your sort of compaction at different layers in the soil.
Yeah. So those are some really good options with a look at lime in particular, because if we're going to spend £1,000 on something to do with soil fertility next year, then it's probably to say it should be on lime first before nitrogen. Again, that's always been the case. Should always have spent money on lime first, well, soil testing and lime before applying nitrogen. The interest with lime, particularly with nitrogen prices being so high, is that it will increase grass production annually. It could release, so correcting the soil pH by using lime or a lime type product, so sand will be included, could release up to 80 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. Also, it makes the phosphorus and potassium that is contained in most soils, but normally is locked up, so it's bound to other particles. It helps that to be unlocked and made plant available. So applying lime generally and doing nothing else, so applying lime and doing nothing else, generally over the course of 2 or 3 years, you'd see an improvement in the P and K indices for the soil. Also, the pH being in the right place, and we think the right place is between 6 and 6.5 for a mineral type soil. If that is in the target range, you get a better response rate to any nitrogen POK mineral fertiliser that is applied. So not only do you get more grass production by having the soil pH in the right place, you get a better response rate or increased efficiency from any artificial inputs you do apply. So it's a bit of a win-win in that case.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see the sort of maintenance levels that you've got on the graph, because you don't always think about that, do you?
No, not at all. And the maintenance needs are pretty huge. If we look at the top end of maintenance, so if you've got a sandier type soil, which is pretty free draining, then you're going to get some leaching of those lime particles. Plus, if you're highly stocked and you're selling a lot of milk or meat, per hectare, and you add in if you're using nitrogen fertiliser, then it's not hard for a farm to need a ton of lime per hectare per year, which would be roughly in line with the rule of thumb of a ton an acre every 3 years. Yeah, so there is a need for it, and if it's left unchecked, so of all the years, this is the year to get soil tested and to correct the pH where needed and where possible. There's probably up to a maximum limit. I think maximum limits for lime, suggested or recommended application of lime is up to around 5 tonne a hectare in one application. So our other short-term options is, if we are using artificial nitrogen, thinking very carefully about our timings and how much we're using. So a timing would be when the soil is warm and there's adequate moisture and the plant needs it. And the rates would be better off going with an extra application and putting less on than by trying to put more on in one go. So applying at lower rates. So this is a range of sort of 20 kilos of nitrogen, 20 to 40 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per application, as opposed to sometimes where we see people put on 60 to 100 kilos of nitrogen per application, and it's not being used. The plant's maybe only using 50% of what's being applied. So there's massive losses, and those losses are now very expensive.
And I'm guessing it's pretty important to sort of know the sort of the end value of what you're putting on. So sampling of your farmyard manure and slurry would be highly recommended, I guess.
Yeah. The slurry manures, they're now a big asset to the farm, and the value of those has just doubled as well, because or a proportion of the value of the nitrogen, those has just doubled because the cost of buying it in is much higher. So getting those sampled and saying, particularly we're looking at applying it to crops and to the silage of crop, working out what's in what you're applying and then how much extra you maybe going to need to top up, then that's a really valuable piece. And the other piece to consider is anything around foliar application, and that could be of nitrogen, but that could also be of other products such as sulfur and boron, which will give good yield responses and also improve the efficiency of any applied nitrogen. So, but some of these subjects are really for, it's time for discussion with your agronomist or whoever else may be providing you with agronomic advice. You need to treat grass, particularly silage, as a proper crop, and the inputs we put on it to give need to be giving now an excellent return in terms of their efficiency. With the livestock system, then we've also can have a look at some of the alternative sources of forage. So we've separated, I think, probably the 4 main ones there, because we're using nitrogen to grow more pasture. So if we don't want to use or can't use as much nitrogen because the cost is prohibitive, then what else can we use? We could rent land, and if that's £100 an acre or £247 a hectare, and it's able to grow 8 tonnes, bear in mind the caveat to that would be 8 tonnes organically without input, then that's we're actually buying effectively dry matter at 3p per kilo. So that's actually maybe cheaper than we can buy grass or grow grass ourselves. We don't need to reseed that land, and we may not apply lime for it as a short-term let. So maybe a reason that the value of land that's let out degrades because people are taking quite cheap feed off it and not coming back properly. But that's a different conversation. But renting land to grow grass to bring into the system now looks very cheap at current land rents. Buying in silage at £25 a bale for a round bale. Most round bales of silage contain 240 kilos of dry matter. We pay £25 for the bale, which is a reliable price in most years. Then we're effectively paying 10p per kilo. We could buy in hay, and if this was a 6-string bale and it weighed 450 kilos, it cost us £35 per bale. It's containing about 380 kilos of dry matter, and that's currently 9p per kilo dry matter. And the last piece that we're more familiar with costing is concentrate. That's £265 a tonne. It's about 95% dry matter, so it's 950 kilos of dry matter per tonne. It's costing us 28p per kilo dry matter. So compared to concentrate, we said that the grass growing with nitrogen alone was 16p. Then it's nitrogen or grass growing nitrogen is still cheaper than concentrate. However, it's the margin we can make from that feed that we need to be aware of. So, yeah, those are all options. And we can see which the low cost options. So land's the lowest cost, and it gives high energy, high protein feed. Concentrate also gives us high energy, high protein feed, but it's more expensive. Silage, depending on what you buy, could be quite variable. So getting silage sampled before you buy it may become really important, so you know really what you can afford to pay for it. And then hay has got a lower energy and protein value, but it is also a relatively cheap source of feed for the right stock class. So which of these may be suitable as an alternative or in addition to artificial nitrogen really depends on where the farm is located, the stock class it has on it, and what's available in the local area.
You could see the silage and hay price soar through the roof after our discussion, James.
Yes, yeah, well, maybe the line will as well, but
That's right.
you know, in the curious way in which farming operates, somewhat due to the subsidies that are still being paid, we're generally able to buy in forage for far less than its real value, because yeah, it's 10 pence per kilo dry matter, but that bale of silage, the nutrients it contains would actually be worth 20 to 25 pounds anyway.
Yep.
In terms of PK and N. So it's still a very low cost form of feed.
Yes.
Providing we can convert the kilos of dry matter into something to sell. So high quality silage would look very cheap at £25 a bale, and that's what I say, that knowing what the silage is maybe is the biggest difference in terms of what you can afford to pay and what you can feed it to. The last bit in terms of short-term options would be, you know, to have a look at the farm stocking rate and its feed demand. And I think a feed demand in terms of kilos of dry matter per hectare, and you can compare that to, or think about that in terms of what's the natural production potential of the land. So, for instance, you know, if a dairy cow needs about 5 tons worth of feed a year, and a suckler cow needs about 6 tons, or a suckler cow system needs 6 tons per breeding animal per year, if the farm's only capable of growing, let's say 8 ton, well, that instantly gives you a stocking rate. And if your stocking rate's higher than that, then it means your extra animals based on the brought-in feed or fertiliser you're using. And as the cost of those goes up, there's becoming less margin to carry those extra animals. So if your farm can only carry 60 cows, but you're trying to carry 100 now, that was working, it may have worked this year. But if nitrogen's cost is now doubled and the other costs of inputs have gone up, if you can't use an alternative source of forage, it may be that the 40 cows you're carrying aren't providing any profit and may actually be costing you more money. So, you know, driving the farming system isn't about maximum numbers, it's about optimal numbers related to how well you can convert the feed you grow or the feed you buy in. And that's always been the case. It just means that this, whether it's short-term or whether it's long-term rise in nitrogen, it's just made that, you know, all the more serious because it's got so much more expensive.
It's making us think very, very carefully about what we keep and what we dispose of, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So, you know, this isn't saying everyone should be stocking rates and that's the solution, but it is saying you should be really make a serious assessment of the animals on farm and remove any that aren't performing or that you're carrying unnecessarily. So if you're carrying your animals that have got 3/4 or that aren't in calve, or that are, you know, were due to be culled anyway, you think about keeping or didn't get in calve, maybe you've got more breeding animals than you need in terms of replacements coming through the system, then all of those options should be taken. And they can almost be taken immediately, you know, and the market prices, thankfully, for stock are pretty good as well, particularly for things like cull animals with where the beef price is. So there may be some easy options. There may also be like a chance for a longer term review of the farm business. And we're not sure what this nitrogen price increase is going to be, but it says not just the nitrogen, that's the most obvious piece. All farm inputs are going up. So, you know, stocking the farm sensibly is going to become really important to maximising profit. So think about medium-term options, and the reason these are medium-term is because they won't have an effect immediately in 2022, whereas all the other stuff we've spoken about will. You change your grazing management in March of 2022, you'll start to grow more grass in March. Whereas things like legume establishment, well, it's now too late to do it this year. So most of the effort, when we say legumes, I mean particularly red and white clover, and maybe particularly clover or white clover, certainly in a grazing scenario, you're going to establish that, you'd first want a soil test, because it's not going to reduce the chance of establishment if the soil pH is below 6. So you would soil test, you probably look at the compaction, and we'd look to try and rectify those two before attempting to establish. If the pH was in range and the soil structure was suitable, then the opportunity to do so, to establish, would be in spring of next year, and it would be post the first grazing of the field. So if you're operating a rotational grazing system, you'd look to apply either by broadcasting or by sort of scratching in with an Einbock or sort of tine type cultivator, springtime cultivator with an air seeder into the sward during probably late March and April, after the first grazing of the year in that rotational grazing system.
Am I right in thinking, James, that it's got to be the soil temperature's got to be a bit higher for legumes, sort of 10 degree type of thing?
8 or
8
so,
to 10?
Yeah, reliable 8 to germinate. Now we're fortunate down here not to worry too much about risk of frost, and depending on how high up the farm is. So if you're up on the top of the downs, that may be a higher risk, and something means you might have to wait till later in April. But probably for the majority of people, then first grazing round, so late March and through April, would be to broadcast to the paddock. My feeling would be to get the seed there slightly early, and as long as it doesn't germinate, it's there ready to go, so to speak. The grazing management after that then you have to be a little bit careful to avoid the sward doesn't close up and the clover gets shaded out. So on a rotational grazing system, you're looking to graze the paddocks a day or two earlier than normal to keep some light going into the base. But that first grazing rotation normally is quite long, it's like 45 to 60 days. So there's enough time for the clover plant to get established, and then it's too small to be grazed off on the next grazing event on the second round, but then it's well established enough to be grazed in the third round. Now, very hard to establish clover in a set stocking situation where the animals have access to the field all the time, because as soon as it's big enough to eat, it will get eaten, and it will get eaten again until it disappears.
Yep.
So silage fields may be slightly easier to establish because they're getting a rest between cuts, but again, you need to get light into the base. So after first cut, the opportunity would be to try and stitch in some clover into the open sward, but maybe second cut has to be taken earlier to help promote the growth of that clover in the base. But all of these methods, the plants aren't going to be fixing a lot of nitrogen until they're 12 months old. So the benefit will come in spring of 2023. So it's an investment well worth making once the soil pH has been improved, but it's not going to actually impact at all really in 2022, apart from incurring maybe some cash costs in buying the seed and doing the operation. So
can I just sort of ask what sort of rate you would suggest for applying the clover seed, James?
It needs to go into a paddock that's got some space for it. So right. If we're assessing a field that we want to do it in, we want to be able to see the soil.
Yeah.
And we want to see about, I'd suggest, at least 10 to 15% space in that sward. So cattle grazing fields is normally fine in, unless it's a very dense permanent pasture, and most newer lays it's fine in as well. So we need bare space. If we have the bare space, then yeah, 2 to 4 kilos an acre.
2 to 4 kilos, yeah. Yeah.
I'll think of a sort of a small to medium leaf white clover if it's going to go into a long-term lay situation for grazing. And then in a silage situation, the rate's probably going to come back to maybe 1 to 3 kilos, and we're probably favouring red clover. So I think that would suit the system. So yeah, so that's more of a medium-term option now, and with that we've also got the piece around diverse swards, so increasing plant diversity by using more different types of grasses, including legumes such as red and white clover, and including some herbs, because those diverse swards have been shown to yield very well without nitrogen.
And thinking of that, James, going forward, the mid-tier stewardship is still open. Will still be open next year for the use of the GS4 option, which pays quite a reasonable amount of money, and will last you for the coming 5 years.
Yes, yeah. So, and this is why it's medium term. It's next year, and that commitment to the GS4 option, which is a herbal lay or mixed species sward. Different terms for the same thing. As you said, it's a 5-year agreement, isn't it?
That's right. That's right.
And would need to be established, and there's some establishment costs to that, but does provide a 5-year payment. So, any business that's growing grass is it's an option to consider, but you've got to take the full, I guess, costs into account with that, including the establishment piece. If you wanted to do the whole farm, you'd have to put the livestock somewhere for a year or for 6 months whilst those lays got established. So it's a strategic piece with that. Yeah, I think in that as well, we said about foliar applications of maybe trace elements like boron and sulfur. We can also apply nitrogen through foliar application, and that can be done using a liquid nitrogen product or a liquid urea product, or i.e. a purchased product that's sort of made up, ready to go. Or it's also possible to use to dissolve urea in water, using a sort of a relatively low cost but specialist setup, and then to spray on that nitrogen product directly onto the crop. So again, it's a discussion probably with agronomists to talk about the intricacies of this working, but I've got the other part of the table we shared earlier, and the full trial, which is a link to in the first slide, was this project in Wales, which looked at, yes, the response of nitrogen compared to no nitrogen, but also the response to a foliar application, so to a nitrogen applied to the leaf using a conventional sprayer. And you can see here in the last column, with the numbers in bold, the additional yield and the response rate, so kilos of nitrogen per kilo of N. And we see here it's really double to 4 times that of the granular nitrogen. So, and this is potentially relatively exciting. It isn't exciting in the place that, well, this is great, what we'll do is we'll just do this and this will solve the issue. It will short term, it will make the nitrogen efficiency much greater, or this method has much greater nitrogen efficiency, so the cost of the kilos of dry matter therefore reduces quite a bit, but it's still underpinned, the efficiency is still underpinned by the soil health, and that's lime or pH and soil structure. So getting those right will still give the best response, and they're still needed to get the best response from the nitrogen, wherever that's applied. So it always starts with the soil health, and I guess it's one thing we know is that inputs will almost never get cheaper. So although foliar applications will give a break, will give some breathing space from increased prices, it won't be the final solution, because nitrogen also comes with a carbon footprint, and as businesses get asked to become carbon neutral, they'll have to start paying to offset that carbon footprint if they can't do it in the business. So the cost of nitrogen will keep going up, whether it's the physical cost of the product or it's the business cost of using it because of the CO2 emissions created by making it. So I think with all that, we'll leave with some thoughts for 2022, or spring of 2022. So if nitrogen is going to be used, then it's probably in the spring it's going to have the best or the largest economic effect. It certainly has the potential to, but common mistakes in the spring are going out too early with too much nitrogen and not getting an efficient response from it. And in that case, and particularly next year's case, that will be a really expensive mistake to make. So if it's going to be used in the spring, it can only be used, it's only effective if soil temperature and moisture are not limiting. So measure the soil temperature, and if you measure it at midday, you should get the average temperature of the day and night. You should only apply when it's above 6 degrees, and that's the soil temperature at 4 inches. And we also think about moisture as well. And so last year it was a bit of a pain in the ass because, sorry, this year, 2021, the spring was quite dry, but it was also quite cold. And it's the combination of the two meant that the response rates from nitrogen were really, really poor. So if that was to repeat, then we need to be aware that urea being spread needs 10 mil of rain within 3 days to avoid really high losses. And that would lead to really poor efficiency as well as big environmental consequences. Ammonium nitrate's a bit more stable. It needs about 4 millimeters of rain to dissolve. So that's better in cold conditions, potentially. So better in dry conditions, potentially. Neither are good in cold conditions. And if we're going to apply, as we said, reduce the application rate, but maybe go on more often. Remember that response curve from the arable slide? You know, the best response is with the first 50 kilos applied, and after that response diminishes. And it's all about, because if you apply too much, the plant just can't use it, and it's just lost, it's leached, or it's lost to atmosphere. So lower amounts more regularly they're going to get a far higher efficiency for the same amount of product ultimately being applied.
So the old advice of little and often is still good, then, James.
Is completely.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's what wraps it up. Yeah, the hike in price means you need care. Every farm really should be a high user. Every farm really should have a plan as to what they can do to minimize the use of it, and then also to make sure anything they do use is to get the best efficiency from that input. As I said, there's some really good help through Penwith Landscape Partnership. I can help with grazing management, which we said could give a massive effect, and that could be instantly achieved in spring of 2022. The landscape, and particularly yourself, Phil, can help with the soil testing.
So
yep. 10 fields free of charge, and then any additional fields at cost.
And then the use of the penetrometer for compaction testing, and then we got the aerator available at a very reasonable cost of £60 a day plus VAT.
Yeah. So I think that gives the opportunity. The farm normally spends, let's say, £5,000 to £10,000 on nitrogen. They should be repurposing half of that money into other things for the coming year to ensure that it can maybe maintain the grass that it needs to grow, so maintain production, but do it through the soil health and grazing management method rather than through the purchased input. And the knock-on benefit is if we use less nitrogen fertiliser, then our environmental impact is lower and our carbon footprint in the system is lower as well.
Yep. That's going to be the new norm, I think, James, don't you?
Yeah. We said a lot of profitability is around optimal or efficient use of inputs and maximising or optimising the amount of feed the farm can produce.
Brilliant.
So, and that's always been the case. And hey, sometimes the farming policy might be flexible. If nitrogen's back down to where it was in 2023, then this decision making might change slightly. But overall, the trend for input costs has always been up. So the farming system needs to be designed with that in mind.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, James.
No, not at all, Phil. Appreciate that. And we'll get this wrapped up and posted soon.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you all for listening. Cheers.